Welcome, everyone. The sun has come out as we settle in this morning for the urgent case to mobilize capital. I'm Claire Lyons with water.org, and also here with some of my colleagues from WaterEquity, and an extraordinary cast of characters this morning are going to share their experiences and cases with you. Good welcome to everyone online. But we're so happy to be back together at World Water Week. I'd like to introduce Steph Smits, who is our moderator today. He will take us through the panel, and then we'll have plenty of time for discussion at the end of the session. Please have your questions ready.
Okay, thank you very much, Claire, for these words of welcome. I will now provide you a bit of background to this seminar, and particularly to this session. So this session is the second out of a three-session seminar focused on water-related investments and economic development. And as you see here, this seminar consisted out of 3 sessions. The first one, which was last Tuesday, focused on the social and economic benefits that investments in water can bring, and what kind of benefits these are, both at macro level and at micro level. But it also explored why, even though there is an economic rationale, economic benefits, social benefits, why is it then that some of the investments that are needed are not forthcoming? During this session, we will actually look at what are some of the solutions to that. So it's titled The Urgent Case to Mobilize Capital. And we will hear from the speakers different innovative financing mechanisms that help to unlock the financing that is needed. And we will also look into what has worked, what has not worked so well. And then after that, or after the break, I should say, we will be able to hopefully turn on the investment tab. There we will take it further into what is then needed to really scale these experiences, what is needed from the public sector, what's needed from the private sector, to leverage the investments needed. So, as this is the second part, let's first look a little bit what came out of session 1, and thanks to Choi for who was chairing that first session for providing these inputs. First of all, that session showed that water-related investments can really significantly contribute to both the economic and the social development. And I think I'm probably preaching here to the choir if we say that. Secondly, it already concluded that more innovative approaches for finding effective and more comprehensive investments are needed, and that these most of the time will require some combination of private and public investment. And I think what we will see in the cases today, some are more on the private side, some are more on the public side, some are really a blend, and we need to tease out under what condition is what blend needed. And within all of that, we also particularly, or in that session, they particularly also looked into what are then the additional investments that are needed to make the water sector more climate resilient, to adapt to climate change. And actually, I think one of the key conclusions there is that climate change and resilience really must be considered from now on throughout all the stages, from the preparation to the design, and in most cases, some kind of hybrid approaches between green and grey infrastructure are needed for that. So please take along these conclusions from session 1. I think these form the starting point for what we will be talking about today. So this is the agenda. After my first words of welcome, we will have 6 cases. I will introduce each of the speakers as they come on stage. So these are really 6 examples, case studies, if you like, of innovative financing mechanisms, and we will look into what has worked and what has not worked on that. After that, we will have a discussion with the presenters as panel, but also with you. We have prepared some questions, but we above all like to hear from you as well, your reflections, your questions, your thoughts on this topic. And then in 1.5 hours from now, we should be wrapping up, but I should say wrapping up this session, because we will take them then to session 3 after the coffee break. I will skip these because I will introduce each of them as they come on stage. The first person I would like to call is Bill Twyman. Bill is a water and sanitation specialist with Agua Consult, a UK-based consulting firm, And his work primarily focused on water supply in rural areas, and with a particular focus on professionalizing management arrangement, institutional arrangement for rural water supply. And within that, he is currently, amongst others, a researcher on the USAID-funded Real Evidence and Learning for Water, the REAL project funded by USAID. So, Bill, over to you. And you have 5 minutes, and I'll indicate when time is up.
Great. Thank you very much, Steph. A real pleasure to be here today, and thank you very much, everyone, for joining. As it says on the screen in front of you today, the focus of this short presentation is really going to be about bringing the insights from part of a study that AgriConsult and IWELL conducted for water.org about this time last year, and focusing in particular around the insights in relation to the impact of water supply and sanitation improvements financed through the water credit approach on household finances. So to begin with, a little bit of a quick introduction to the work that water.org is doing through its water credit approach. So as I'm sure many of you are aware, water.org has been quite close to kind of at the forefront of microfinance lending in the water supply and sanitation sector. And it now, through water credit, works with about 149, 150 partner financial institutions to kind of design, to create, and to launch microfinance loan products that are really tailored to their local context and the needs of the particular individuals. A couple of key points to kind of reflect on before we dive into the findings. The first is kind of around the scale at which this approach is operating, which is quite significant. So we're talking about a total of $3.8 billion in total capital mobilized, and that's been used to fund, I think, about 48 million water supply and sanitation, or water supply and sanitation improvements, for 48 million people. The second kind of key set of statistics is around the typical profile of the borrowers or the loan recipients to these products. So we're talking about an average loan size of $361. We're talking about 87% of people living under $6 a day. So while we're not hitting the complete base or the complete bottom of the pyramid, we're still focusing on low-income households, and there are a considerable proportion of households under $3, $4 a day as well. And then just finally, I think, to reflect on the fact that we've got an average kind of loan repayment rate of 99%, so above kind of a typical average for microfinance in the sector more generally. Next slide. So I'm sure many of you have already seen kind of the key headline takeaway messages relating to the economic value of water supply and sanitation improvements. I mean, very briefly, I think there's been past studies by developmental economics such as Guy Hutton around the economic value of water supply and sanitation, which have gone into a lot of detail and quote statistics such as $28 billion a year for water, if we had universal access to water supply improvements, 140 billion or so on the sanitation side. And we know, despite the challenges in the sector, that it's also a cost-efficient investment. So cost-benefit ratios of about 4.4 for water, 3.3 for sanitation, and even up to 15 for hygiene interventions. And this is what the water.org really internal data that they've collected through their past work really reflects and mirrors. So we've got a total of 38% of water credit customers report that their water supply and sanitation improvement has resulted in an improvement in household income. And we see here quite a significant kind of variance between countries. So at much of a low point, kind of just 2% in Brazil, up to 62% in Cambodia. And this variance, whilst quite significant, is somewhat explained by factors such as the existing water supply and sanitation service and the water supply and sanitation improvement that they chose to finance. The study, which I'm sure we can kind of share and is available online, went into much more detail beyond that kind of headline message and focused on kind of 5 key pathways. I won't go into all of these now before Steph starts shouting at me, but a couple of them in particular I think are worth kind of spotlighting or focusing. The first one is around kind of time gains, and the time gains that typically result from water supply and sanitation improvements that are financed through water credit or the water credit approach. So what we saw was a typical time saving of 267 hours per year per household for a water supply improvement across those 5 countries that are on the screen, and an even greater time saving of 425 hours per household per year on the sanitation side. And this, merging this information with kind of wider estimates or calculations or formulas from past studies, we calculated that this resulted in a household-wide economic value of $60 per year for water supply improvement, $96 on the sanitation side. We also got lots of findings related to direct or secondary income gains, direct cost savings, improved health outcomes, and indirect cost savings, which I won't go into now. But I also wanted to reflect quickly on the findings in relation to financial inclusion, which we know is critical in terms of bringing people into the financial ecosystem and achieving broader developmental impacts. So this is an area that water.org doesn't have that much data on, but we know from looking at the approach that it ticks many of the boxes required for financial inclusion. For example, around partner financial institutions taking on people without any sort of credit history who weren't previously customers or loan recipients, and also in terms of reaching kind of 74% rural borrowers, 89% female borrowers, again, typically harder to bring into the financial ecosystem. So very quickly to bring some kind of conclusions or takeaway messages. I think the first one is really around kind of reaffirming what I'm sure most of you already know around the economic value of water supply and sanitation improvements, and that roles in terms of achieving the broader developmental agenda. The second one, and I think perhaps a little bit more germane to the wider session that we're having today and discussions moving forward this week, is around the role that water credit and microfinance lending can play in terms of bridging the enormous financing gap in the sector. So this has previously been estimated at around $114, $115 billion a year. That was 4 or 5 years ago. I'm sure that's increased exponentially in the interim. I think from the microfinance approach, in terms of the number of the total capital mobilized, nearly 4 billion, the number of water supply and sanitation improvements, about 48 million people being reached. Also the typical kind of profile of a borrower. This has kind of shown that it can play a key role in this, and it's something that can be scaled more broadly moving forwards. So back to you, Steph.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, so now we move from, let's say, the microfinance scale to, I think, more the meso macro level finance. And for that, I would like to invite Regina Rossmann forward. Regina is a senior associate with the training and member engagement team of Convergence. And prior to Convergence, Regina was a policy advisor at GIZ, and before that also at the World Bank in Washington. And she is going to talk about blended finance. What is blended finance? Where has it been used? And what does the future for blended finance look like? Over to you, Regina.
Thank you. So in order to get the investment scale that we need for achieving the Sustainable Development Goals, we all know that public investment alone won't do the trick, right? So that's where blended finance comes in. On the next slide, we can see how we at Convergence define blended finance. It's essentially the use of catalytic capital from public and philanthropic sources in order to mobilize the private capital into SDG-aligned projects. So what does that mean? Development funding can come from organizations like the Gates Foundation, the Osprey Foundation, some other philanthropic organizations, or the development agencies and funders in this room, so USAID, AFD, and so on. Now, this money is usually deployed on concessional terms, meaning below market terms. So it can be grant funding or a low interest loan or first loss equity, whatever you may call it, right? So this money is used in order to mobilize institutional investors. Pension funds, insurance companies, private equity funds, you name it, right? Anybody who has a commercial purpose at heart. And so this money, what all of those actors have in common is they deploy it at market rate returns. So they are looking to make financial returns, right? Whether that's in the form of a loan, so debt or equity, it doesn't matter. Now, you may wonder, how can that be done? What is an example for a blended finance structure? On the next slide, I will show you the most common blended finance types that we at Convergence have seen in the market. And so on all these diagrams that we have up here, I want you to keep in mind that the gray slices, so the grant funding here or the junior equity here, that's the concessional capital, right? So that's where USAID, AFD, the German government, and the Osprey Foundation come in. And then the blue slices here, that's the commercial capital. So that's where you see the institutional investors. So let's start here at the design stage grant example. So design stage grants are grants that come in very early. Basically, you're blending over time. You start with some grant funding to get that entity, whether it's an enterprise or somebody else, to be investment ready. So one example from the sanitation space is Sanergy, a sanitation enterprise I'm sure many of you are familiar with. So Sanergy got design stage grants from USAID and some others very early on in their lives in 2011. And later on, they were able to raise equity from Novastar Ventures, for example, a venture capital fund. So without that early on grant funding, Sanergy would not have been ready to take on equity, right? So that's what we call a design stage grant. Technical assistance, I'm sure many of you are familiar with. USAID's WashFin program would be one example, where they increase the capabilities of the projects or the enterprises, whoever is at the bottom there, the portfolio company, and that enables these organizations to go on and raise debt or equity, right? So it's technical assistance that sits outside in a facility, and that provides some capacity building. So the Nature for Water facility from the Nature Conservancy would also be another example. I believe it's being launched later today, so stay tuned if you want to join that. Now, results-based financing, I'm sure many of you are familiar with as well. Development impact bonds are the most common form of results-based financing. So one example would be the Cambodia Rural Sanitation Development Impact Bond. Guarantees is something where I'd like to mention the Private Infrastructure Development Group. Garantco, for example, works a lot with guarantees in order to bring down the risk for the commercial investors who come into the project. But the most common form of blended finance that we at Convergence see is actually the last one here. And this is where you insert concessional capital directly into the capital stack. So this, for example, could be a fund like Climate Investor 2. And you can think of this as a layer cake, right? There's different slices of money. And the gray ones here, what they do is they bring down the risks for the senior investors. And so the senior investors, the ones that sit on top, they feel more comfortable because they are protected. They have a little risk cushion underneath them. So that makes them more likely to go into this transaction. Incofin's Water Access Acceleration Fund would be an example for an organization that uses this type. And Climate Investor 2 is another one. And why I bring this one here is because it's huge. The scale that Climate Investor 2 is aiming for is 1 billion. And that's exactly what we at Convergence would like to see, right? We need projects and funds that are at scale, that don't just look to mobilize 10 million or 15 million, but 100 million plus. So on the bottom here, you see some of the Convergence members that are part of our network. Because as you may have realized, I have used a lot of finance terms, right, in the last couple of minutes. And some of you may not be familiar with those terms, and that's fine. But here's the thing. If we want to mobilize the private sector, we got to speak that language, right? And so that's the work that our organization does in partnership with all these. We train them. We also help them connect to each other and share their experience, and together get more comfortable with that finance language. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I think that was a very nice overview of the different forms of blending. And now we will go in a bit more into depth into one of those examples, for which I'm inviting John Moyer from WaterEquity. John is a chief investment officer at WaterEquity, and in that sense, he oversees WaterEquity's investments, including the strategy, the due diligence, the structuring, and the monitoring of these investments. And he has more than 15 years of experience in financial services, also in relation to water and sanitation in emerging markets. He has worked with Water.org, and particularly the entry into the Southeast Asia market many years ago. And before that, he worked with CHF International, now Global Communities. And John, he will be talking about the structuring of funds through WaterEquity and how that blending, and that Regina described very nicely conceptually how that works in practice. Welcome, John.
Thanks, Steph. Good morning, everybody. I think this should give a good example that really follows on what Regina was laying out at the high level, the WaterEquity experience. So just by way of introduction, excuse me, WaterEquity is the first dedicated asset manager specifically focused on water and sanitation. We spun off from Water.org in 2017. We've raised 3 funds so far, totaling over 200 million US. We've made about 60 investments, reaching people in 16 countries. I'll share a bit specifically about our experience raising capital to try to shed some light on this question of how public and philanthropic funding can be used to try to catalyze private investors. You can go to the next slide, Steph. So here, that's not showing up quite right, but you can get the sense of our fund growth. So Fund 1 in 2016 was quite small, $11 million, basically friends and family fund. Fund 2, 2018, we started to achieve that scale that Regina talked about, climbing up to a $50 million fund. And then in 2021, we closed on a $150 million third fund. Steph, let's go to slide 4. Actually realized this morning that I had a better chance of keeping everyone's attention if I actually jumped to the heart of the question at hand here. So this is really the data on private investors. That chart on the left there shows the three funds. The aqua bar is basically foundation money, water.org money, WaterEquity money. Let's call that the public or philanthropic money. The navy bar is private investors. Let's put aside Fund 1. That was small. It was $11 million. It was mostly friends and family. Even the private investors were kind of insiders. Looking at Fund 2 and Fund 3, you can see we had tremendous progress, moving from 15% of the equity in the fund in Fund 2, funded by private investors, to 60% in Fund 3. That's at the same time as we tripled the size of the fund. So we're talking about a $50 million fund to a $150 million fund. So if you look at the chart on the right, you can see these figures in US dollar amounts. So Fund 2, we raised $4 million in equity from private investors. Fund 3, that climbed to $31 million. We also were able to diversify the private investors in Fund 3. It included high net worth individuals, asset managers, mission-aligned corporates, and other types of private investors. Let's go back to slide 3. So how did we accomplish this? This is obviously a lot of information, but it's trying to summarize the capital structure, as Regina described it, the layer cake of each fund. So Fund 1, friends and family, as I said, very simple. One, equity share class, no debt. With that track record, we were then able to scale up and attract a more diverse pool of investors with Fund 2, but it wasn't a straight line to private investors. So Fund 2, that's blended finance on steroids, basically, right? We have 3 equity share classes. We have 4 separate lender agreements, and it's all backstopped by a first loss guarantee provided by WaterEquity, which is ultimately supported by our foundation partners. While it wasn't a direct line to private investment, it was definitely successful in kind of diversifying the investors that we were able to tap into. We had foundations come in a big way on the equity tranches, which helped us move beyond friends and family. We had Bank of America come in as a lender, and we had the United States Development Finance Institution, USDFC, come in as a lender as well. That experience positioned us to kind of go back to a simple structure with Fund 3. One equity share class, one lender, and no guarantee. And DFC increased their commitment from $20 million in Fund 2 to $100 million in Fund 3. I wouldn't say that Fund 3 represents kind of the end of the road in our journey towards private investors, but it definitely shows significant progress. So what lessons can we take away? I'll share 4. One, Regina touched on this, scale is essential. These blended structures take time to put together. We should pursue them for investment strategies that can be scaled up, not for one-off investments. And also, many private investors have minimum ticket sizes that would prevent them from investing in a small vehicle. 2, investors need to see, private investors in particular, need to see track record. So as water sector players, we likely need to use public money, philanthropic money, our own balance sheets to establish that track record and then try to gradually bring in the private investors. It's likely to be a gradual process. That's okay. 3, DFI investment due diligence is challenging, but if you can get to yes, it's a stamp of approval that attracts private sector money. Also, sometimes DFI capital can match private investors, which encourages them to come in. And then 4, I'd say private investors, they need to see professional asset manager at the helm. Water.org took the approach of setting up its own with WaterEquity. Others have, in the water sector, have hired a third-party asset manager. Either approach is fine, but having that credible pair of hands at the wheel helps to bring in the private capital. I will leave it there. I think I'm out of time. Hopefully our experience has shed some light on this, and happy to talk with anyone more after the session.
Thank you, John. I think that was a very nice example of how you go from a 1-layer cake to a 6-layer cake to a 2-layer cake, but all to attract that blend of finance that was explained in the beginning. I think these examples were really from the water sector as such, but as we also saw from session 1, I think it is key now to also bring in climate change adaptation into that. And for that, we have invited John Ikeda to explain us a bit more about how we attracted climate finance to the water sector. John works for Castalia, and he leads Castalia's work on the financing and delivery of water and sanitation services. And his areas of expertise are sector strategy, blended finance, and financial and economic analysis. And prior to Castalia, John worked with water and finance with the World Bank, the Green Climate Fund, and Abt Associates. John, over to you.
Thank you. So as you mentioned, we heard at the previous session that climate has to be embedded at the center of water. And what I want to talk about today is that water finance is climate finance, full stop. And I don't think we've done a good enough job in the sector of telling that story. But we have to do that in order to mobilize the investment needed to achieve the SDGs. And I think climate finance is, as you point out with blending, it's an important strategy. It's an important source of financing that we can use to bring in more private sector investments. If we go to the first slide, just to recap a little bit about the story, about the co-benefits that we can see from water investments on both the mitigation side and the adaptation side. On mitigation, the water sector is a huge source of emissions. For water supply and sanitation, we know that non-renewable energy sources for treatment, for pumping, generate emissions. And there's been a lot of really interesting recent research looking at the impact of wastewater and on-site sanitation in the emission of methane. Methane's 25 times more impactful on climate change than carbon is. And wastewater accounts for 7% of that globally. Additionally, looking at irrigation, looking at dams, there's tremendous opportunity to reduce the carbon footprint of the water sector. On the adaptation side, climate change is the water cycle. Right? That's the primary channel for the impacts. We have variable rainfall, which makes resources land for. Hotter temperatures are going to increase demand for water. And finally, we have extreme storms. We have sea level rise that's going to increase the salinity of aquifers. It's going to damage water infrastructure. Water and climate are interrelated. And so water finance is climate finance. So to look here, so first let's talk a little bit, what are some of the water finance investments that lend themselves to a climate finance approach? So if we look at the graph here, we have a few different types of investments on both the mitigation side, which is the darker blue, and the adaptation side, the lighter blue, arranged from less commercially financeable, where more blending is required, to potentially fully commercially financeable. And what's interesting, if you notice here, is that the mitigation investments tend to be more commercially financeable. And the reason for that is private investors like to get paid back, right? So cash flows, hard cost savings, these are the sort of things that enable private investment. And non-revenue water reduction, for example, that generates revenue for utilities. Energy efficiency upgrades, those are cost savings. On the adaptation side, it can be harder, right? This is about the avoided losses from climate change. It's about strengthening your infrastructure against the shocks and hazards of climate change. It's about building the resilience. So in some cases, things like providing microloans for household level rainwater harvesting systems that can build resilience. If the ability to pay, if the willingness to pay for households is there, it can potentially be commercially financeable in the short term. Other times, more subsidy might be needed in order to build that. Other things like nature-based solutions for flood control, in the short term, these are hard things to finance commercially. And a lot more work needs to be done to pilot innovative approaches. There's been some work in middle-income countries, in upper-income countries on using tax increment financing, of essentially ring-fencing the benefits that this sort of gray and green infrastructure provides due to increased land value property and earmarking sort of future tax revenues to finance that investment. But this is challenging to adapt for many countries. So just to look at one specific example that I think is particularly relevant for a climate finance approach, and it's something that's fairly mature, right? Non-revenue water reduction, we know that it's a major source of avoidable emissions. If you think about technical losses, in other words, the water that's lost through leakage, it's it's not non-revenue water. And this comes back to this story of how we pitch this in the sector. It's wasted water. It's wasted energy, right? This is energy that is spent to pump water right back into the ground. And even with commercial losses, money that gets to customers, it gets to other households that's not paid for, you don't have the price signal that's needed in order to encourage efficient use of water. So non-revenue water reduction, this is work that we've done with a number of governments and utilities, is helping them structure these sort of performance-based contracts that bring in commercial financing to reduce non-revenue water. Typically, it's thought of a money-saving exercise. Part of the role of framing climate finance as water finance is to ask, what are the emissions? What's the resilience benefit as a result of this? So finally, just to recap, because I know I'm running a little bit over, I think development finance institutions, climate funds, these are one source of public climate finance that the water sector can tap and use to blend with private investment. And then impact investors and other interesting sources. So Climate Investor 2, as you mentioned. Castalia has been working with World Resources Institute to develop a new urban water resilience fund for Africa. Labeled bonds, such as climate bonds, green bonds, blue bonds, these are another potential area. And finally, carbon offsets are another area that should be explored. So I know I'm at time, so thank you so much.
Thanks, John, for, I think that was a very nice also framing. The water finance is climate finance, and what that means, and how, as the water sector, we can attract climate finance, but then also very quickly going into the kind of structures that we saw earlier. During the various presentations, we have also heard the key role that development finance institutions can play. So in that sense, I'm very happy that we have also the next speaker here, Mr. Mchera Chirwa, who is from the African Development Bank as the coordinator of the Africa Water Facility. And he will explain to us what are some of the lessons learned from the African Water Facility and what role multilateral development banks, development finance institutions can play. Mr. Chirwa is a Malawian national. As I said, he is the coordinator of the African Water Facility, and he has been working for more than a dozen years at the African Development Bank and has more than 25 years of experience in delivering and leading infrastructure development projects across Africa. Over to you, Mr.
Thank you very much, and thanks for the opportunity. Mm-hmm. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to bring in a perspective, the African perspective, to this whole idea of mobilizing investment for the sector and what role we are playing to do that. So the African Development Bank hosts a special facility called the African Water Facility. It's an instrument that was created by the African Ministers' Council on Water to mobilize investment into the water and sanitation sector in Africa. It's a unique facility in the sense that it's the only Africa-focused project preparation facility focused on Africa. And as you'll appreciate, to bring in investment into the sector, you need to have very good projects and well-structured and prepared projects to attract the investment. And that's the role that we play. Since in existence, since 2004, we work with multiple donors and partners, some of which are listed there. We've mobilized about 250 million euro so far. 170 million has been deployed in preparing 125 projects, which have brought downstream investments in the region of 1.5 billion. Our assistance has helped to provide access to water supply to about 13 million people in Africa and 8.3 million in sanitation, 52% of which are obviously women who play a key role in delivering water in Africa. So basically, our support has also gone to 52 different countries in Africa since existence. Next slide. Some of the unique aspects of this facility, like I said, it's the only African-focused project prep facility for the sector. So our focus is only water and sanitation. We work across the countries, all the countries in Africa. We work on rural water supply, we work on urban water supply, we work from water resources development right down to water supply and management. We also provide specific focus to improve governance, because if we want to bring investment, the institutional and legal framework is key. And I'll share some lessons towards the end on what we have learned over the years. So we are able to provide that kind of support. We have 4 strategic areas right now. The key is project preparation. The second is what we call catalytic investment. So basically, we are able to deploy reasonable resources into investment that will attract more capital into the sector, and where we also see potential for innovation and replication. So we selectively look at opportunities where the technology or innovation in a particular investment will be able to attract additional investment either in that country or in other countries. But also we're focusing on investment promotion. So all the projects that have been prepared in Africa, and there are quite many, and not all of them have attracted investment. So basically we're looking to see how to structure those with the different countries to attract investment. And this could be a mix of private investment as well as public investment, and blending plays a key role in that. And the fourth and quite important element is governance, water governance, where we're helping to support institutions to build capacity, to undertake reforms that are necessary, and especially now with the increasing interest for private investment, this is key to be able to structure projects and ensure the environment in the country is conducive. I mean, we know that the money is not the problem, it's good projects and institutional arrangements that are key to unlock that investment. Next slide. I talked about innovation. We're trying to build in innovation in the work we do, where we can provide small investments or seed funding that will scale up or trigger new projects and investments. So when we select projects, we look at such opportunities. Africa being so diverse, you'll find perhaps an example in Rwanda, working with private sector in that country, which can be replicated in other countries that are not yet at that level. So this is an area where we are providing that support. Next slide. Some examples. Ghana, we have done a sanitation project there using a model that has private and public, and where we are able to empower small and medium enterprises to collect sludge and take it to a treatment plant and convert that to biogas and organic fertilizers. Use of solar for operation of rural water supplies in Ethiopia, piloting rainwater harvesting, and other examples which are available on our website. The key lessons that I want to share from our experience is, first, a small investment to prepare projects is key to unlock bigger investment. So basically, we have experienced that €1 that we invest in a project can actually mobilize up to €29 in downstream investments. And that's key to get good projects prepared. Secondly, to attract private sector investment, we need to work with governments to ensure that the institutional and legal framework is key, is in place. They have the capacity to actually mobilize a structure or put together a structure that will attract investment. And also, that's the role we play as a DFI in the African Development Bank to help sit with governments to build that capacity. And also, selectivity is key. So basically, identifying investments that will actually make a big impact, but at the same time, in a market that is able to attract investments and be able to replicate elsewhere. So I'll stop there, and thank you very much. I'll be glad to take questions afterwards.
Good. So money is not the problem, it's the governance. That's a point that I will come back to later, because if money is not the problem, maybe we just close this session now and start discussing governance issues. And actually, that is what the next presenter will be talking about. The next presentation will be on economic, social, and governance assessment for attracting city investments. This presentation will be done by Dr. Mira Mehta. Mira is a professor emeritus at CEPT University in India, and she is the center head of the Center for Water and Sanitation. She has over 45 years of experience in water, urban development, and infrastructure finance, both in countries in Asia and in sub-Saharan Africa. She has served as the director of the School of Planning at the CEPT University since 1992, joined the USAID FIRE-D project in India, and later the World Bank and its water and sanitation program in Africa. And she has a wide experience consulting also UNICEF, World Bank, Asian Development Bank, WaterAid, Government of the Netherlands. So I think, I think with this we have a very befitting final speaker in this round of presentations. Over to you, Mira. This
must be on our website.
This is what you provided to me. Over to you.
Thank you, Steph, and thank you for asking us, I should say. The first slide is not there, but my colleague Aditi actually works on this area, and she couldn't come, so I'm actually replacing her and conveying some of our ideas that we are developing. And it's in the context of these large numbers that we see. In fact, these numbers, this is what Guy Hutton developed, I think, a few years ago, 2016. And to me, these numbers look little small, actually, 100 billion per year for the whole world, because we are actually doing something like this in India currently. So I don't know how these numbers, but anyway, but I assume these numbers are big. And if we have to do next, and I think the point was that it is 3 times the current investment. This was in a few years ago. That's a key point to be made. And we must remember that WASH infrastructure is, no matter what we talk about in terms of private sector coming in, blended finance, etc., largely financed through public finance. And 65%, these are numbers from Glass survey a few years ago, 2-3 years ago, but they may not have changed dramatically. So that's something that we must keep in mind, and it's how to leverage those public finance and attract more funding to come in is something that we need to keep in mind, and something that they have been highlighting, although I have slight, what do I say, I'm not that comfortable with the typical PPP trying to get private finance in. I think my friend Joel is not here from the World Bank, but his recent blog, if you see, he actually says that most of these large PPPs, not much has happened throughout the last few years. So that is something that we need to keep in mind. And we are arguing for a slightly different approach, looking at leveraging public finance or public utilities, local government, their role, and getting things like municipal bonds or green bonds, blended finance to some extent, but I think limited extent, I feel, and things like development impact bonds, which is emerging as a way to get impact investment in. But again, I feel that maybe the main trick is to something that we have not looked at as water sanitation sector on the first item, and that's something that I want to little bit talk about next. And in that context, something that in the corporate sector is becoming very, very important in mobilizing investments in corporate sector is looking at what is called as the ESG framework, the environment, social governance framework. And it is almost becoming mandatory for corporates to have their rating or their assessment done against the ESG principles. And this is something that's happening throughout the world, I would say, of course, more dominated by North America, Europe, but even in India now we find that corporates are beginning to pay attention to ESG and the investors are also looking to these. So that is something that is very, very important to keep in mind. And therefore, looking at ESG rating for WASH utilities and local governments, and I'm talking, if we are talking more of urban, then the urban local governments as well as utilities, their ESG rating, their assessment becomes very critical if we want to attract investors into these utilities, or through capital market through bonds and so on. So that is something that we are really arguing for. Next. The idea is that if you have ESG rating, if you are good on ESG rating, then it will become it will become easier for you to attract this kind of financing. There has been some recent debate, economists, those of you who will read that still, the Economist has been, how do I say, questioning this whole ESG, saying only environment is important, but then McKinsey has now come out to say that no, all three, and especially governance is very, very important, and social aspects are also critical. So these are the kind of arguments that are going on, but the keeping in mind that this is something that's, and if we are talking of accessing markets, then these are the numbers that we need to be looking at. You see here the bond market is really $0.47 trillion, and that is something that our sector somehow doesn't really seem to be able to access. And that is where, go back to looking at local governments, utilities and their ESG may be one way to do that. Next. This is something that we have started to do in India, to look at our cities in terms of their ESG ratings. We have public data on services, and we have public data available on municipal finance. So using this data and other publicly available data on environment, we have developed a framework by which we can actually assess ESG rating. This is one city in Maharashtra in India for which, but we have done currently for about 20 cities. We are doing this with one of the major consulting financing group company, private sector in India, and something that we hope to take forward more. I think there is one more maybe. No, sorry. Okay, that was the last one. I wanted to end on this note. I saw Louis sitting here. Louis put faith in me to do a study on microfinance. This was about 15 years ago or so. And that time nobody was really looking much at. I found only one Bill Kingdom study on microfinance for water done earlier than that. And we did, they supported me to do this major study looking across quite a few countries. And I think it showed that there is huge prospect in terms of bringing in microfinance in water and sanitation sector. Not in terms of just volumes, but the kind of impact. And I'm so amazed to see the kind of achievements that Waterdog.org has achieved over the last few years. Some of that hopefully has come from that first study that was done. And in terms of only pointing out what the opportunities are, that's all. I'm not claiming anything else. And there are others also who have similarly taken up. So I'm hoping that this becomes the next round of such an idea. I'm looking at Louis, maybe Osprey can fund us to develop this idea further. No, but just to end then, I think this is an idea that can actually take off. And in India, we are quite poised to do this because there is data available of this type, and we now hope to catch government's interest to do this. So let me end here. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mira, and we'll do the deal making during the coffee break. I think here we can get the ideas, the deals can be closed there. So I think what we have heard is the idea today is to talk about the urgent need to mobilize finance, and I think we have heard different types of finance being mobilized: the microfinance, the bonds, the different forms of private investment, debt and equity, the degree of blending that is needed for that, but also the key role that public funds play in either project preparation or in strengthening the governance, and linked also to the ESG rating. So if I hear all of this, it almost sounds a bit what you were saying: money is not the problem. The problem is governance, and that is, I think, now a little bit what we would like to discuss. Is that really the case? Do we have the enough supply of money? Is it really the matchmaking, making sure that the governance is in place, or are there any other barriers and limitations there? So that's a little bit the focus where I would like to start discussion, but I'd also like to hear from you as an audience if you have any questions, any reflections that contributes to that debate. More factual questions, I would suggest you take them on later. Let's now focus more on the more reflective points of discussion. So if you have any points on that, any ideas, any examples, please share, and please also introduce yourself.
Hi, my name is George. Sector is in a sort of a searching way also. What was missing there was the regulator, and it was under pressure of finance that the regulator finally sort of was created. Still not really there. I just came back from Mali, similar situation. What lack of institutions can you work with? That would be my question. So how sort of missing can you still function to do your thing? And I really appreciate your remark about people that are necessary to do the thing, because that was what John was mentioning. That was, I remember that I really see, you can have all these instruments, but you need people to be credible to do your work. But what missing institutions can you work with? How much can you miss and still be functioning with the funding?
Okay. I see Bill nodding, and I know that Aqua Consult did a study on the role of regulators in Africa, so maybe you would like to respond to that.
Yeah, so maybe just to begin with by framing this in a bigger issue, and as Steph mentioned, we conducted this very large study looking at the status of water supply and sanitation regulation across Africa. Yeah, and it was in Central Africa, in countries like Niger, where the greatest challenges exist, where you've got these very poorly defined regulatory functions housed within a ministry which lack the capacity to perform it. And I think what I see and what we saw from that study was regulation really kind of sat at the centre of addressing lots of these governance challenges. And if you look at countries like Kenya, Zambia, Uganda, even without a regulator, Tanzania to a certain extent, they've been able to take really important steps forward, with the regulator often playing a central role in terms of us linking up those developments. I think what I would say in response to your question is that I think you can sometimes work with a ministry, but it's much, much harder, and it is required. And we see here the financing challenge is very much linked in with all of these other challenges in the sector, and it's a very hard question to answer. You can sometimes work with a ministry, you can sometimes work with other agencies, but until we start connecting these dots between the separate aspects of the system and the enabling environment, we're not going to be able to move forwards in one direction like financing.
Okay. Anyone else from the panel members want to respond to that? In what lack of institutions can you still establish the instruments type, the types of instruments that we have been seeing? Anyone else want to point to that?
Go ahead.
No.
John goes first, then here.
Well, I guess you can't make a blanket statement about every country, and it really depends on the level of development, the level of institutions, as you point out. But I think it's really two things that needs to be addressed. The first one, on the institutional side, on the regulatory side, it's about building a pipeline of investable utilities, investable service providers. Yeah, I think we sort of assume sometimes that the money is there and it's just waiting to be unleashed. But personally, I mean, how many of you would put your own retirement savings into a bankrupt utility? Right, so the role of the regulator in strengthening institutions, strengthening the service providers so that they are ready to access commercial capital is important. But I also think the second part of it that doesn't get enough attention as we talk about water finance is the broader financial sector and the level of development there, the broader macroeconomic environment. These are long-lived assets in many cases, 30, 40 years sometimes. And so if nobody can borrow, not just utilities, but if no sector is able to borrow in the country at that level, if inflation is at such a level, forex rates are at such a level that it's not viable, then being realistic about the kinds of things that can be invested in is important. And I think particularly, bond markets are something we need to explore in much more detail. But again, we have to be realistic and look at the countries where it's feasible. They are issuing bonds now, or they can be issuing bonds in the near future. In other cases, I think microfinance is something that can be explored. There are microfinance sectors in a lot of countries, and the research that we've seen, the work that Water.org has done, has shown that there is the willingness to pay for a connection, for a latrine, but often not the ability to pay, right? If you spread it out over time, there's plenty of households that can afford it. But when you ask them to put that lump sum in, to take a large amount of money up front to invest in, several $100s for a connection, it's just not possible.
Good. Mira, you wanted to come in, and then we have another question from the audience.
A minor point that, I don't know, minor or major, but that we need to maybe look at urban local governments versus utilities within quotes. Urban local governments, there is generally already not a regulator, but a regulatory framework, and the kind of acts and other aspects that are already there generally for local governments in most countries. So if you have local governments as the borrowers and service providers, that's a very different scenario than a utility. Utility you separate out, then you need all the other institutionalized also. So keep that in mind, and depending on which country and what.
Okay, good. So I think an important point to differentiate who is the borrower. Is it the utility or the local government? We have one question there in the back, and then I saw Louis, and then here. So we'll take the 3 questions, and then sorry.
Thank you.
It works. It already works.
Yeah.
I think I can speak up like this.
It's for the audience.
For the video. For the online. Sorry. I had a question for Regina. Do you also consider giving blended finance to household level? We saw the impact on the household level, and I give you a short example. In Zambia, sorry again, my name is Henk Holzloff from the Smart Center Group. We train local private sector in Africa. So my question is, do you also consider blended finance for families? Because I give you an example. In Zambia, we install boreholes of $1,000. They serve 50 people, and the finance is given, the donation of 50% is given to the family. So part is donation, part is paid by the family. So of course this is small, but if you do this 1,000 times or more, it's becoming big. So the question again is, will you consider blended finance for families?
Okay. You can pass the microphone there to Louis, or maybe you take your question. Okay. Or you.
Louis Borson from the Oscar Foundation. Thank you, Mira. Gary actually in his book with Matt Damon cites that study. About halfway through the book, which was a lot of fun to read. Just with respect to Stefan, what you were saying earlier, look, he's got the book. I think it's useful to think of finance as following. To your point earlier, do we need to worry about money? Finance comes out of 2 things, which is risk and return. And that's really what all these folks do for a living, is try to figure out the risk and return. And so if you're in a situation where you can't get the commercial finance, that is always because those issues of risk and return are what's underlying the decision. So as long as, and I'm saying this for folks who are not finance professionals, it's not all that complicated. There's no mystery to this stuff. It's really about understanding those 2 underlying factors.
Okay. Then you had a question?
Yeah. Thanks very much. Good morning, everyone, and thanks to a great panel. I'm Belinda Petrie from One World Sustainable Investments. Question mainly for both Chiwa and you, John. You made the point that water finance is climate finance. I'm not going to argue with that. And Chiwa, you were saying that you need really strong projects to make them bankable. And therein lies my question. Because there's a little bit of a but for me, and maybe you best to answer it, John, but what do you do when you've got a project, programmatic, that's addressing climate issues and there's business as usual finance that's needed as well? So maybe you're plugging holes in the leaky system and you're building climate resilience with the same project. They're quite different things to fund. And often the Green Climate Fund, which I believe you have some history of, is really interrogative of the need for a climate rationale. So how do you address the non-climate aspects that have actually traditionally been very difficult to finance, particularly in Africa? Just some reflections on that, please.
Okay. We have the first question, I think, for Regina, and then John and Pierre.
So to the question of how blended finance can reach households, from Convergence's perspective, it is indirectly. So the types of transactions we track are funds, facilities, projects, bonds. Some of these work with financial institutions to on-lend to households, right? So in that case, the blended finance will ultimately reach households, but it's not by giving the money directly to the household, but working with the bank on the ground, which starts then to lend to households for water sanitation investments, similar to what water.org is also trying to achieve. So that's the type of transactions that we track. But I would say, of course, like in the end, when you look at some of these transactions, in the end, the idea is that the households will be able to afford, right? So it is very much connected, but from our perspective, the transactions we look at Convergence, they only reach the households indirectly through an intermediary. Yes, that would be my answer.
Okay. John?
And that's a great question about, how do you bridge water finance and climate finance? What's missing? If you look at Green Climate Fund, when they look at investments to evaluate, it's really two core metrics. On the mitigation side, it's how many tons of CO2 equivalent are being avoided. And on the adaptation side, it's how many people benefit from improved resilience. And where there's a need, I think, for more public support and sort of the pre-blending that needs to happen is to build that evidence base for the water sector. And when you have that story to tell, it makes it much easier to package water finance as climate finance. And two quick examples there. At the World Bank, we were working on a guarantee for a water supply project in an African country. And we did the climate analysis, and essentially this was piped water supply in a large capital city that would be replacing tanked water. I mean, tons and tons of tanker trucks. I mean, you go to the city and you would see 20 of them in a row sort of sitting there idling. And when we calculated the carbon footprint of that versus the cost of treating and transporting piped water, it was gigantic. And it just made such an obvious case for investing in this, not just for the benefit of bringing people better water supply, but of massively reducing the emissions in the city. And the second one around carbon offsets that I thought was very interesting, there was a conference earlier this year, the Global Water Summit in Madrid, where they completely offset the carbon emissions of every participant who came by making a donation to a sanitation NGO working in Haiti called Soil. And the reason they were able to do this is that Soil has very good evidence base, making a very clear link between the work that they're doing, essentially 1 unit of input of support, and the amount of emissions avoided that come out of that. And so the better that we can, the deeper evidence base, the clearer we can build a story around that evidence, the more likely we are to mobilize effective climate finance.
Okay. Yeah.
Thank you. And just to add to that, I mean, so for all the projects that we support, right, at the preparation stage, we want to ensure that there's a deep analysis on the impact that project will have on the climate and how to build in resilience. So for example, now we have a program that we're doing in 5 countries, 3 Sahel countries, that's Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso, and then 2 Horn of Africa countries, Somalia and Ethiopia, where we're helping to develop projects in water and sanitation for rural and urban. And for each of those projects, we're building in a climate resilience window, basically, to scan how to design those projects in a way that will help to build resilience. And be able also to mobilize climate financing, because that's the other angle. There's so much money sitting there. How do we bring that investment into the sector? So this is also true for the African Development Bank itself. At the investment side, we try and make sure that for every project that's being financed, there's an analysis that looks at these elements and how to build them in. So this is standard now.
Okay. Any other questions? So, Marcus?
Yes, we have a number of questions from the audience online. Thank you so much. Yeah, so we have one question for Regina first, but I think it's a broader question. So it's a question that hints at the fact that water often recognized as a sort of social good is often not priced or is not, the tariffs are not set at the sort of cost of return levels. And how can you deal with that, or is that a problem, and what can be done about this challenge to make sure that these sort of water investments can be commercially viable in that situation? And secondly, we have a question for John Moyer that is asking about the sort of a minimum size of a small ticket. So basically the sort of minimum investment that is sort of viable, and particularly looking at countries in Africa where the sort of investment portfolios or the sizes of the investment might be smaller. So is there any sort of minimum size that you would consider feasible or viable? Thank you.
And Marcus, can you please introduce yourself also to the other members here in the room?
Yes, my name is Marcus Salmon. I'm from Economist Impact Research Arm of Economist Group in London. Thank you.
And Marcus is one of the co-conveners of this session. So, first question for Regina.
Thank you. That's a great question and one that's often discussed. How can we ensure that water is still affordable while we want to bring in private investment? And I think there's multiple levels to this answer. One is regulation, right? Because ideally, the water level, like the price of the water tariff would be somehow specified. And then there's the pro-poor element where you can just use more grant funding, right? There's no issue with pro-poor subsidies, and the private sector is not saying we can't have any subsidy. That's not true, right? So if you can make sure that you separate out your customers and you have the ones that really needed it supported more with grant funding, while those commercial ones and maybe also the government entities actually pay their money. And by the way, government entities, especially in developing countries, a lot of times are the ones who are also just not paying. So if you can get the payment right from the government entities to begin with, then you already have a good number. And then if you can show to the private investors, look, this is what we are doing in order to get in the money from those who can afford it, that is already one step closer where you want to go. And then the last thing I would say is that you can also look at money for additional revenue streams. The type of things that John has been describing. Carbon offsets, for example, can provide an additional top-up, right? And if you can show that you are also getting in some money from those carbon offsets, for example, then you don't need to get that much money from the water tariffs in total. So regulation, trying to distinguish your customer groups and getting the money from those who can afford it, and then thinking about additional revenue streams. Those are the types of solutions I think that are out there.
Very clear. John, on the minimum ticket size, and because I think that's, earlier on it was mentioned that the size matters, you need to work at scale, but at the same time I think there's an interest in sometimes having smaller tickets, smaller flows of finance. What's your reflection on that?
I think the short answer is it depends on kind of your blended financing structure ultimately. So what I presented was focused on kind of the investors into our funds. I think this question is asking about the investments we're making in emerging markets. The vast majority of what we've done so far has been lending to financial institutions in emerging markets. We are increasingly focused now on investing directly into larger scale infrastructure, which I'm happy to talk with people about this week. But to the point of the amounts that we're lending to financial institutions, you have to keep in mind that as an asset manager, our business is basically earning fees on the capital that we manage for investors. And we have to cover our costs to make the investments with those fees. So if it requires 50 investments to deploy $10 million, obviously that's much more cost intensive than if we make one loan for that amount. So it's a very important question. Right now our minimum ticket size is $1 million. That doesn't mean that the smaller borrowers are not reachable. It just would require a different model for the business, right? We would need some additional blended money to come in and help cover the operating costs of doing more due diligence on more small investments.
I think that builds a bit on what Regina was explaining earlier on why that blending for households goes indirectly, because that reduces in a way these overhead costs. Regina?
Yeah, I would just like to make one more comment here on aggregation. So this is also another benefit that blended finance can bring, is that blended finance offers you a way how you can aggregate those small projects that only require maybe 500,000 or 600,000. But the problem is it needs a fund manager who's able to do that work, right? So the fund manager needs to find and identify all those small investment opportunities, get them into a bundle, then go to the private investors and sell that, right? And so I want to also build some, almost patience between those of you, because the fund manager comes knocking at your door, and it may take 3 to 4 years until that fund manager has the money together to give it to the projects. Now, in those 3 to 4 years, what do the projects do? They just sit there and wait? No, they get their money somewhere else, right? So if we can all manage to try to reduce the time that it takes some of those organizations that are putting together these blended structures and get them to financial close faster, the projects get their money faster, right? So I have some sympathy with the fund managers who are doing that very hard work for aggregating those projects. And when they come to your door, don't take 2 years to get that financial decision. If you're going to say no, just say no right away. Just don't tell them, come back in 6 months and show me your structure then, right? Because that's not going to help them at all. And as you saw in their second fund, look at that structure. Like if some of the development banks would just say, no, I only have money for this country. And the other one says, I only have money for this region. And then they have to go back and rearrange everything. Now that's going to make their work very hard, right? So I feel like if we can all work together to simplify some of the conditions that come for those fund managers, that would be a tremendous help. So I have some hope for the future.
So I think this is the first time at a water conference that someone made a call for more sympathy for fund managers. But good, I see 2 questions there. Sorry.
Yes, thank you. My name is Wolfgang Hützner. I'm working for GFA Consulting Group in the Water and Sanitation Department. I was also active as team leader in a financing facility for output-based aid in Tanzania for a couple of years, where we supported water utilities and lobbied some finance from commercial banks. To my experience, about more than, I would say, 90% of projects significantly delayed. So my question would be, how do you deal with such delays in the blended finance scheme? Cheers.
Okay, I think next to you there was another question.
Hi, morning. My name is Teresa. I'm working for a GIZ project, water project in Zimbabwe. My side hustle in the last 2 years was trying to find funding non-related to water to make an ammonia plant green, which requires about $100 million. Everyone thought it was a great idea, climate and stuff, until I told them that I was in Zimbabwe. So my question would be, how do we find funding for high-risk countries?
Okay, high-risk countries. And then I think Choi had a question here.
Yeah, my name is Geun Choi. I'm the one member of the SPC from the Korea. So, to getting some funding from the different sectors, but problem is that reliability, the term aspect of the reliability will be different to different sectors. So in case of the blended water, so will be a little different from the government officials or multi-development banks. So how can ensure for the reliability? So that's another issue for them. Thank you.
Okay, 3 questions. Who can I give the first one on the delays in the project cycle and how to account for that? On high risk, the investment in high risk countries, and on the issue on regulation, how that is included. Regina, go again first.
Quick. So on the issue of delays, I think that's a very good point because it happens a lot. I wanted to point back to Climate Investor 2 because what they have is actually their own project preparation facility, which is grant funded. So basically what they do is they build their own projects so that when they come in with the construction equity, they can be sure that the project is ready. So to me, one way of how you can get around that problem of the delays is that you know the projects and you have been working with them for that delay period, right? So that you can absolutely be sure, not just through your 1 week due diligence, but actually by having worked with them over the last couple of months that they are ready. So integrating, and it can also be a technical assistance facility or something like that, like integrating a project preparation aspect into your investment fund can be one way to make sure those delays don't take way too long. That would be my answer.
So that's almost, I think, one of your first images where you said, I think it was this one, where the grants
both these two types
are integrated in that in order to speed up and avoid delays.
Yeah, and then on Zimbabwe, I would say one way would be to work with organizations who specialize on these lesser developed countries. UNCDF, the UN Capital Development Fund, for example, I know does a lot of work on blended finance for the least developed countries. But I have to say, realistically, looking at the transactions that we've seen, there is not that many for those least developed countries, and in particular, not for single country ones. So you are better off also trying to integrate your fundraise with some other projects that are in other countries, because if investors love one thing, it's diversification. So they are not going to put their money into something that is so exposed to the country risk associated with Zimbabwe. But if it's in a basket with some projects in Gabon and maybe Kenya or Uganda, then you may be a little bit better off.
And how to work in high-risk countries. Sometimes risk is perceived, not real. But we do provide, as the African Development Bank, risk mitigation instruments. So, and we operate in Zimbabwe. We have an office there. So, work with DFIs like ourselves, working in that country. We understand the issues better and can provide instruments that will help to lower the risk perceived, I would say.
Maybe thinking is different. Like for the private people, maybe from the household, they are thinking differently. But government people will be thinking differently. So how can we increase like reliability? Without reliability, cannot get fund from the other sectors. So that's why I'm asking about it.
How do we bridge that between household and government and takers? Oh, this is then a question that will remain.
Well, maybe the answer is here in the audience.
Maybe the answer is in the audience. Or any other questions? We have still another bill.
Maybe one question for the panelists. I think somewhat, maybe not marginalized or not included in this session so far has been kind of what role government can take in each of these different kinds of financing innovations that we've been talking about. So I think it'd be interesting to hear from everyone, perhaps me at the end, around what role government can play in each of the different kind of financing mechanisms or broad approaches we've been talking about.
Because I think indeed the government plays a role in providing some of that grant funding, the public funding, but what other roles could or should the government play in facilitating that? Any thoughts on that, Chera?
Yes, I could start. I think what we found is key is that any investment that's going to happen has to be supported by the government. This must be an investment in an area that is a priority for the government, for them to actually have a champion who will see that investment happen. Without that, nothing's going to happen.
John?
Sure. On the climate finance side, if you look at the business model for Green Climate Fund, JEF, the Adaptation Fund, they have accredited entities, that help develop projects. I think governments need to reach out to those accredited entities, particularly ones that are local or regional, and help make the case for water and climate. When we analyze the portfolios of these different climate funds, the majority of the adaptation funding was not in water. And so helping the accredited entities understand that business case for water as climate, I think, is very important, and it's a key role for governments to play.
Yeah. George?
sorry for coming back. I was at one point responsible for a result-based management, result-based financing project in Benin, where the governmental actors stole 4.5 million euros from the project. They paid it back. Eventually, we sort of, as the Dutch government, financed a robbery, I would say, because they paid it back, but the people who stole it were not punished. What you see is that implementation of these projects is easily put at a Ministry of Water, and that's not a good place to put it. So you need to separate the implementation from the ministry. And we're talking about governance here. So and separating the contracting, etc., from the ministry is a painful process, just like creating a regulator is a painful process, but they are needed in order to create credibility. The risk part that was talked about, that you need where you need to create a confidence. So I think there is the element that you need to look for, and all these different actors that are there, putting that act together. So the Financial Pressure Act is something that can lead to results, I would say. So there's also a sort of a bringing the things into a basket, and then creating pressure for instance, creating a regulator function that can help. I've seen it work that way, but I've also seen sort of the sort of robbery taking place, and I assure you, it is not a nice position to be in. But you can also see that if you are strong enough, because what happened in our case, this was in 2015, what happened in our case is that because it was not just the Dutch finance, but we were doing it together with the European Union. So ours was 40 million euros, theirs was 20 million euros. But there was also future funding from the European Union, and we were also financing something with the World Bank. So the World Bank also stepped in. All of a sudden, there was, I think, a future funding of like 500 million euros at risk for the government. They accepted the forensic audit. They accepted to change a lot of things as a result of that pressure being created. So getting that act together is also very important.
Okay, good. There was one more question here. Two questions.
Morning. I'm Anise Sakrani. I'm from Grundfos. And I don't want to spoil the sympathy we've been giving to fund managers, but actually fund managers come to Grundfos and say, help us find projects. And actually for that reason, Grundfos has begun to develop a project pipeline. We are doing that in Ghana. We're doing it in Ethiopia, across Africa. And really my question is, what can we do better to develop that project pipeline? Because Grundfos is going above and beyond what Grundfos' role typically is. We're only a part of the solution. So what can be done to actually develop that project pipeline so there is somewhere for the money to go?
Okay, then Lisa.
Hi, thanks. Lisa Rudge from the FCDO. So we've heard a lot about working with government. I was wondering which part of government. You mentioned championing investments, but who has to champion those investments in government? Who do we work with? We heard about the regulator, Minister of Finance, but also the importance of the macroeconomic context. So who is it really that holds those strings, and who do we have to work with? Thanks.
Okay, good. So the project pipeline, and which part of government do we work with? Mira.
Just to, in terms of working with the government, and I guess my last few years of experience is more from India and not so much from Africa, so bear with me for that. But I think you need to work with all levels of government. It is very, very critical. That because there are some policies that are set by the national government for large countries, federal, the state or the regional level government, and then the local government. Quite often we tend to ignore the local governments when such projects happen, and they come and are being forced on the local government rather than being done with the local government. And it takes much more time. It requires more patience. We work with local governments, in large number of local governments in India, and we try and make sure that their processes are followed. It's not that we go with our process and impose our processes on them. I think these are subtle things, but they are very, very critical in terms of working. If your project is approved in the normal local government, and it takes ages sometimes, because you have to go through the local government body, the political body, all of them have to approve, then the administrative process within, all of that has to be done. So that is one thing. Second is that I think governments have to set up their own processes for project selection. We have now in India, in many, even in most cities, I think, in most states, processes whereby electronic tendering is now common. Local governments cannot do tendering just like that. There are rules that they have to follow. They have to follow the internet-based tendering process. These are things that are, I'm not saying that there is no corruption, obviously there is some, but still I think this makes it far more open and far more transparent. So I think these are some critical things that we have faced. There are some small private sector, there is much more actually regular public sector projects that have happened. But there are instances of public-private partnerships like we have done for sanitation, for scheduled desludging, working with a very, very small local government, but following all of their processes, not our process. We have assisted them in developing the tender document, but they were reviewed by them, and they are satisfied, then they are uploading those tenders. So those are things I think that, but that does take time, my dear, so I don't know how to get over the time issue, but...
Regina, and then John, and then we'll wrap up.
Great point. About how to build better project pipelines together. I would say there's two ways how we can improve as a sector collectively. One is sharing the due diligence. And I know that some of the smaller foundations, including Osprey, are doing a great job at just huddling together and sharing information that they have obtained, looking at one deal and recommending it to one. And that's why for some of the projects you will see that Osprey Foundation starts in first, then Vitol Foundation comes along, then Stone Family Foundation comes along. Why? Because they know each other and they talk to each other, right? So that's one way. The other way, I think, if you look at the fund managers, is the fund managers have to be as close as possible to those who provide the technical assistance. And that's where WaterEquity has an edge, because you work with water.org, right? But equally, sometimes the impact fund managers who are not so familiar with the water sector, they come to me and they say, how can I find some bankable projects? And I tell them, go to USAID's WashFin program, ask them, because they are the ones who are working with the actors in the field, right? Don't try to do it all by yourself. Go to those who provide the technical assistance and just be open in asking, right? So I feel like if we can get better about sharing those details, and if you, for example, rejected a project or an enterprise because your money doesn't fit them, refer them to somebody else. And at Convergence, we always tell those who are knocking at people's doors, if those say no, ask them to refer you to one other funder that they know, because we all know each other, right? Like, we all gather in Stockholm. So if we can get a better job at referring the projects and the enterprises to others, then there can be more collaboration. And so that's also what Convergence tries to help with. But of course, we all know we are busy. So I know some investors don't have the time to write 5 introductory emails to each. But it's worth it, right? Because that way you create a better ecosystem for those who are trying to fundraise.
Okay. John, final comment from your side, and then I will be wrapping up because we need to leave at 10:30 sharp.
Certainly. Well, so very quickly, I think both to build, a large project pipeline and also to work with the right levels of government. A very quick case study, we just recently advised the Ministry of Water in Kenya on the development of their national water and sanitation investment plan. And this was, they had a very interesting approach to this, where they went to every single county and they asked, what is your pipeline of projects? What do you need in order to achieve universal access? They helped them, they sat down with them, they did sort of pre-feasibility studies for some of these. And we helped them develop a process to rank these, prioritize these in a transparent way, come up with financing strategies for these. And it not only was a way of working with different levels of government, it was also, a way of building this list of projects. So the government of Kenya now has, over 2,000 different screened projects that, I think a lot of different investors and donors should be looking at. And this is relevant really for any country that has a decentralized government and that it allows subnational finance.
Okay, thanks for that. Now let me try and wrap up. I think for me one of the key phrases of this session was the money is there, the problem is somewhere else. And we heard different sources of money. We heard about microfinance, we saw the larger scale private investors, private equity, we saw the municipal bonds. But to unlock that, I think what we heard, the first step is that project preparation that consists of having the evidence, doing the analysis, including analysis on the climate, the additionality, let's say, of the climate, doing the due diligence, I think what Lewis had, looking into the risks and return, having the project pipeline, having all of that in place. So that's the first part, and what we heard that often needs to be grant financed. That's where that first part of blending comes in. Then you can come into what I would call the blending as such, making the 6-layered cake or the 2-layered cake or the 5-layered cake. And there I think we heard the key role that professional fund managers play, because that is almost the financial engineering. That's where things take place like aggregation, making baskets so that the risks are spread. It's also the task we heard about the fund manager trying to link that to TA. Again, the TA can sometimes or often does need to be publicly financed, and we heard some examples from that. And so that's a key task for that fund manager for whom we need to have more sympathy. Then the implementation, who takes on the finance? I think what stood out for me is there we need to differentiate whether it's a utility, whether it's a local government, whether it's a Ministry of Finance. And all of that whole chain, let's say from the project preparation to the structuring, to the implementation, takes place in a broader governance environment, and often also there is the public finance needed to strengthen that governance framework, having regulation in place. And I think what I heard a bit, it's not only water sector regulation, but also financial sector regulation or public finance sector regulation. And in that, I think several points were made there. We need to actually understand that, understanding that getting these kind of things off the ground probably require a certain maturity in the financial sector as well as in the water sector. Doesn't mean it cannot be done in less developed or less mature financial markets, but probably the scale will be different. And we heard also about that, the maximum ticket size, minimum ticket size, which is what the investors can have, but also how you then break that down into the actual projects that are there. And I think that's the final thing. I think what I picked up a lot is that we need to keep on making the case, making up the case for water investment is climate investment, making the case to the private sector on what the risks and returns are, which is strengthening that broader enabling environment. And I think those were, all the main points that were discussed. And with that, I would like to thank you all as presenters for your contributions made. I also like to thank you all for your contribution, for your insights, questions. I'd like to also very much thank the members of the organizing team, Claire, Matus, Lisa, and many others who made this session possible. And I know that this conversation hasn't ended. First, we need to have coffee. I think that's most important. But then in half an hour from now, we will have the third session of this seminar, where we will look into how do we now take this further and untap. It's in Pilarhallen. It's downstairs at the ground floor. Thank you very much.